Welcome once again to our studies in the Gospel of Mark. Today we reach the final section of the first chapter, and it's a fitting climax to the awesome story that Mark has been reporting for us so far. So without any further delay, I'd like to read this paragraph to you. Mark tells us, "A man with leprosy came to Jesus and begged him on his knees, 'If you are willing, you can make me clean.' Jesus was indignant. He reached out his hand and touched the man. 'I am willing,' he said. 'Be clean.' Immediately the leprosy left him, and he was cleansed." Jesus sent him away at once with a strong warning. "See that you don't tell this to anyone, but go, show yourself to the priest, and offer the sacrifices that Moses commanded for your cleansing, as a testimony to them." Instead, he went out and began to talk freely, spreading the news. As a result, Jesus could no longer enter a town openly, but stayed outside in lonely places, yet the people still came to him from everywhere. By now, we know that Mark wrote his gospel with a purpose. This purpose has not been difficult to identify, since right at the beginning of his book he indicates that he has written to communicate what he calls good news from God, good news that is to be found in the person of Jesus. In order to demonstrate this, he's described a number of incidents in Jesus' early work, incidents which, Mark believes, convincingly point beyond themselves and indicate who Jesus was and is and what he had come to do. In the present paragraph, Mark is probably recording an incident that Simon Peter, Jesus' follower, witnessed and had reported to him. As we've already seen, there's no good reason to doubt that what is recorded in this book is true, even if we might conclude here and elsewhere that what took place seems pretty unbelievable. In fact, Mark would almost certainly agree. But that's his point. What he describes is unprecedented and is unparalleled, and since this is so, it points to something out of this world, something that actually happened, and surely demands we don't ignore it. Indeed, it seems that especially with this story, Mark wants to communicate powerfully the relevance of Jesus' ministry to you and to me today. There is some discussion among medical experts and scholars as to whether the leprosy described here is what today we know as Hansen's disease. In my view, it probably was. However, whether or not this was the case, there's no doubt but that the condition of this poor man was dreadful. In Luke's Gospel, where the story is also told, Luke, who was a doctor, tells us that this man was full of leprosy. Presumably every part of this poor leper's body was affected by this dreadful disease. But what made it still worse was that in first century Palestine, the laws relating to leprosy, which had been given by Moses a millennium and a half earlier, were rigorously applied. These laws were given to help God's people understand the importance of purity if they were to really be God's own. And while there is no evidence that a leper was in God's eyes worse than anyone else, those who contracted the disease had to be isolated from the life of the community and its worship. Lepers then lived on the edge of human society, deprived of those things that most of us cherish, finding consolation only in sharing their misery with others in the same situation. By the time that Jesus lived, leprosy was believed to be worse than death. In fact, it was a living death. And in addition to this, it was viewed as incurable. Indeed, it was said that resurrection was more likely than the cure of a leper. All of which prepares us for this story. Often it's only when things go wrong for us that we start asking what are sometimes called ultimate questions about life and death, for example. It appears that this was true for this man. It seems then that his condition had awakened him to a sense of his own sinfulness, and it was freedom not simply from his leprosy, but from his guilt before God that he wanted. Thus he asked Jesus not simply for healing, but for cleansing. The remarkable thing is that he appears to have learnt enough about Jesus, though Jesus had only, of course, just begun his ministry, to have no doubts that Jesus could do what he asked. But there's something else that's remarkable here. In Moses' laws, impurity was contagious and was inevitably caught when anyone or thing that was pure came in contact with the impure. Elaborate laws were devised to avoid contagion. However, this man had reached the point in his understanding that he believed he could draw near to Jesus within an arm's stretch, we're told, and not contaminate Jesus. In fact, Jesus, he was convinced, could share his own purity with him. Here then was a man who was convinced that Jesus could deal with his need of guilt and restoration to the community of God's people. Severe though his contaminated condition was, he believed that Jesus could restore him. This is surely good news from God, and could only be accomplished by one who was himself divine. Doubtless this is why Mark tells us this story. It's precisely because Jesus is whom he claimed to be, and Mark believed him to be, that Jesus could and can meet our deepest needs. Above all, the cleansing we need from sin and guilt and shame in order to become once again God's friends. So the leper approached Jesus, and what we discover is that he had no doubt as to Jesus' ability, but only whether Jesus was willing to do what he longed for. If you're willing, he says, you can make me clean. The sequel introduces us to two more remarkable elements in this story. First of all, we're told that Jesus was indignant or angry. Jesus was simply extremely emotional in his response to this man's request. But why was he indignant or angry? It seems to me most likely that Jesus was overwhelmed by the suffering that sin had brought into our world, one consequence of which was this poor leper's distress. So Jesus was deeply touched by this man's condition and the condition that it represented. Jesus then is presented by Mark as a compassionate friend of sinful, guilt-ridden women and men. Indeed, as Mark tells us, Jesus was full of compassion, and showed this by his touch of a man who had probably lacked such human contact for many years. Thus the need of this man touched a chord deep within Jesus, and the very depth of his need evoked the Saviour's response. So the man was both cured and cleansed. Here then Mark is telling us is good news from God. Jesus is able, but also willing to meet the needs of the most abject and needy who draw near to him. What a delightful picture of Jesus is presented here. But there's something else in this wonderful story that we need to understand. As far as Mark is concerned, Jesus is willing and able to meet this man's needs as well as ours, because he is the Messiah of God. Yet how is it that he can meet such needs so fully and compassionately? This narrative hints at the answer in several ways. First of all, as we've already noticed, Jesus doesn't catch sin, he communicates cleansing. It's a remarkable fact that this man felt that Jesus would not be contaminated by his disease, but destroy it. But what sort of person can meet the needs of someone like this sick, guilt-ridden leper? What is interesting here is that the prophet Isaiah, who had lived 8 centuries earlier, had predicted that the Messiah would have a remarkable healing ministry. But even Isaiah did not refer to the Messiah's curing of leprosy. Jesus, Mark is implying, was already early in his life exceeding the wildest hopes of those who with a strong hope in God's promises had lived before him. What more evidence as to who Jesus was could possibly be required? The last couple of sentences in our passage reflect another contemporary practice. Moses had commanded that where a healing was claimed to have taken place, it had to be subject to thorough examination by the religious authorities. There must be no doubt but that the claims were true. So Jesus required this man to go and fulfill his responsibilities under the laws and obtain both a clean bill of health and, on receiving it, to offer to God his grateful thanks. Fraudulent claims are sometimes made as to people being healed, but these are often surrounded by secrecy. That's not true here. This man was able to show that he was healed to the specialist investigators of his time. Finally, we notice two other striking things in this paragraph. First of all, Jesus forbade the man to speak about what had happened. One assumes that part of the reason was that Jesus wanted it to be absolutely clear that he had performed the miracle before stories were circulated about what had taken place. But there appears to have been a profounder reason, and one we will find echoed elsewhere in this book. Jesus didn't want people to jump to conclusions about him too soon. In particular, he didn't want to be simply known as a wonder worker. He wanted those who witnessed his ministry to begin to face the challenge of asking, who then is this? But there's something else that's very odd about the way Mark tells this story. He sends the man to the priests as a testimony to them. Well, that's what the version that I read says. However, it's probably better to translate Jesus' command as referring to a testimony against them. This might be a hint as to what will subsequently happen. Right at the beginning of his ministry, Jesus is aware that the religious authorities, with all their knowledge and expertise in God's past revelation of himself, will prove blind to the testimony of what he does and says. And this is, of course, something that still characterizes most Jewish people and many of those who read the accounts of Jesus' life today. Jesus knew, and so did Mark in recording Jesus' words, that it's possible, very possible, to fail to see what is there right in front of us. Very simply, Mark has in this passage set before us the heart of the good news of which he's writing. Jesus demonstrated that he was the promised deliverer, the Messiah, and that he couldn't have been clearer in his testimony. Mark is convinced then that an unprejudiced reading of his good news can only lead to one conclusion. Today, as then, Mark implies Jesus is ready to forgive and give new life to those who seek him out, however serious their condition. And this certainty exists whether we are seeking him for the first time or are coming once again to him. However, and solemnly, Mark ends with an implied warning. Are we ready to open our eyes to the truth as it is in Jesus, or, like many then and since, refuse to open our eyes to the glorious message that Jesus brings, even today?